This lecture will look at theological exclusivism in Islamic tradition and some key ideas of theological inclusivism today. In this lecture, we will look at theological exclusivist ideas such as supersession, abrogation, and Islam as the religion taught by Prophet Muhammad, not simply self-surrender to God. We will then look at the views of some inclusivist or theologically inclusivist thinkers today very briefly. Let us look at some of the key ideas associated with theological exclusivism. Before we get into that, let's ask what exactly exclusivism is. At its most basic level, exclusivism refers to the belief that there is only one right way, that there is only one way of knowing or believing that excludes all others. In the context of Islamic theology, an exclusivist approach holds that Islam is the one and only true path to salvation. Theological exclusivism is a particular type of exclusivism, emphasis on theological, not social. It focuses on specific theological issues. In this context, our focus in this lecture is on three key ideas: supersessionism or supersession, abrogation, and Islam as the religion taught by Prophet Muhammad, not simply submission to God or self-surrender to God. And of course, related to this is the idea of limited or no access to salvation for people of other faiths or religions. Let me explain these key ideas a bit more. We will start off with the doctrine of supersession. The doctrine of supersession emphasizes that Islam, as taught by Prophet Muhammad, is the last and final monotheistic faith, and it supersedes all those that came before it. In other words, Judaism and Christianity, for example, were only precursors to the most true and final monotheistic religion, that is, Islam as taught by Prophet Muhammad. So, while this view acknowledges Judaism and Christianity as monotheistic and revealed, it only sees them as historical stepping stones to Islam. As a result, according to this view, anyone who continues to follow these earlier religions or faiths now, that is after Prophet Muhammad, is not following the most true and revealed faith, according to this doctrine of supersession. From a theological exclusivist point of view, the doctrine of supersession was not something that developed later after the Prophet Muhammad, but for them it exists in the Quran as well as in the traditions of Prophet Muhammad. For the theological exclusivist, it was a position supported by the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad himself, not a later development. Let us now look at the doctrine of abrogation, or nasakh in Arabic. The doctrine of abrogation is a doctrine or an idea that was originally developed by jurists and scholars of the Quran to reconcile Quranic verses that seem to contradict one another or are in conflict with one another. It was primarily about issues related to law and legal matters. The doctrine takes the position that if there are two Quranic verses on the same legal point or legal issue that seem to be contradictory, the verse that was revealed later has more authority. The ruling in the later text or verse therefore cancels out the earlier ruling. Put simply, the most recently revealed ruling abrogates the earlier or older ruling on the issue. In the context of Islamic theological debates, the doctrine of abrogation is about cancellation or abrogation of earlier revealed religions by Islam. This means that with the coming of the Prophet Muhammad, Islam, the religion that his teachings initiated, cancels the validity of all other religions that came before him. It also means that until Prophet Muhammad, there were a number of monotheistic religions or faiths that were revealed, true, and valid. After Prophet Muhammad, that validity no longer exists. This is the position that mainstream Islamic theology in Sunni and Shia traditions, by and large, has adopted. In the context of inter-religious relations, the doctrine of abrogation has also been used by many to support the idea that Quranic verses that seem to accept the authenticity, truth, and validity of other religions, or the possibility of salvation for the followers of other religions, all have been abrogated by verses that appear to reject this authenticity or the possibility of salvation. There is also another way this doctrine of abrogation has been used. That is, to support the view that what the Quranic verses that appear to be more conciliatory towards people of other faiths say has been abrogated by what the more harsh sounding verses say. For example, if one Quranic verse says, or one Quranic verse that was revealed early in the Prophet's mission says that Muslims should have good, peaceful, and positive relations with people of other faiths, and a later verse that seems to say that Muslims should not maintain such good, peaceful relations, the later verse could be seen as abrogating the earlier one. This, of course, can be seen as very simplistic, as the verses in question can be, or perhaps should be, understood in their proper contexts. If so, we should not be talking about abrogation, but we should be emphasizing the need to understand the verses based on their contexts. Let us now look at the issue of Islam versus Islam. The third idea of theological exclusivism we are going to explore is associated with how the Quran uses the term Islam in a number of Quranic verses. Taken at their face value, these verses seem to make it clear that it is only Islam that would be acceptable to God as a religion. Deen in Arabic, religion, is understood as deen. There are two very important Quranic verses that are often used to support this kind of theological exclusivism. First is from chapter 3, verse 19, which states, surely the true faith or religion in the sight of God is Islam. And in chapter 3, verse 85, it says, or the Quran says, anyone who seeks a faith or religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted from him. Theological inclusivist understanding of these two very important Quranic verses um, insists that they are referring to the religion of Islam as taught by Prophet Muhammad, which means that only Muslims or the followers of Prophet Muhammad or the followers of Islam as taught by Prophet Muhammad are following the true faith or religion that is acceptable to God. But as we shall see, some early and contemporary Muslim scholars have or leave open the possibility that the word Islam in these verses is not referring to any particular formal religion. Rather, it is referring to the idea of submission to God in a very general sense, they argue. What this means is that when the Quran uses the term Islam, it is Islam with a lowercase I, meaning submission or surrendering to God. In other words, the Quran is referring to total submission to God as being true faith. Or in the second verse that I quoted, it is that submission to God that is acceptable to God, according to this view. If this rather inclusivist interpretation is adopted, it is possible to argue that this act of submission or self-surrender is something that is possible for people of different faiths, including Jews and Christians. But theological exclusivists do not accept such an interpretation, and argue that Islam in these verses is referring specifically to the religion that was taught by Prophet Muhammad and not to any general idea of submission to God. Let us now look at some of the criticisms of theological inclusivist positions by theological inclusivists. We could start off by saying that Islamic theology, by and large, in both Sunni and Shia understanding, adopted the three ideas of theological exclusivism we have been exploring so far in this lecture. So it is difficult to find prominent Muslim theologians in the past who had adopted the key ideas of theological inclusivists of our time, which is the 20th century and now the 21st century. So it is safe to say that the theological inclusivism is espoused by figures such as Fazlur Rahman, Abdulaziz Sachedina, Mahmoud Ayub, and Imtiaz Yusuf, and many others, represents a kind of new development in the modern period. Before we look at some of their ideas, perhaps it would be good to look at some examples of ideas that in the Islamic tradition that can provide a certain degree of support for some theological inclusivist ideas. Very briefly, the fact that theological exclusivism dominates Islamic tradition does not mean that in the Islamic tradition there aren't scholars or even trends of thought that may have developed and in fact adopted some ideas that can be understood as supporting some form of theological inclusivism. These ideas, although not necessarily considered as representing mainstream theological positions, have been used by theological inclusivists today in support of their positions. For example, in the writings of some Sufis or Muslim mystics, it is possible to see ideas that could be the basis of a rather vague form of theological inclusivism. Some would argue that Sufis such as Zali or Ibn Arabi or Rumi could be included in this category. Much, of course, depends on how we interpret their writings. An important idea that one can see in the works of figures like these is the strong emphasis on universal mercy of God covering the entire creation or all people that one can see in their writings. And also the view that perhaps one should not be considered strictly speaking, an unbeliever or a kafir unless and until one had the chance to experience the true message of God and then rejected it. If a person has not received the proper message of God as communicated to prophets and has not experienced that, even if that person is not following a prophet or a monotheistic tradition, the belief is that the universal mercy of God may cover such a person. Of course, I am here summarizing lots of complex debates around this issue without necessarily attributing any of the views to a specific Sufi or a scholar. Let us now focus on contemporary theological inclusivism. Contemporary theological inclusivists, by and large, reject theological exclusivist ideas and try to propose new ideas that they think are more in line with what they consider to be in the spirit of the Quran. Theological inclusivists do not necessarily believe that Islam, as taught by Prophet Muhammad, had abrogated earlier monotheistic revealed religions. They also do not accept the view that Quranic verses that seem to support the validity of earlier monotheistic religions have been abrogated. On the doctrine of supersession, for example, theological inclusivists today are trying to put forward some new ideas about how the doctrine may have developed in early Islam. For the theological inclusivists, the doctrine of supersession developed in a particular historical context. One interpretation of its development can be as follows. It probably developed very early on in Islam to help solidify the very early Muslim community. It was a way of emphasizing that Islam, the new faith or religion, was different to other religions, and also that whatever similarities might exist between Islam and other religions, such as Christianity and Judaism, Islam is the final religion. Being the last, it was supposed to be the most complete and the fullest version, so to speak. If one accepts this interpretation, the doctrine of supersession wasn't actually meant to be a doctrine of intolerance as such, at least initially. It was more about highlighting the difference and separating Islam from other monotheistic traditions or religions, and emphasizing its completeness compared with other monotheistic religions. This then removes the possible fluidity that might exist between Islam and the other two monotheistic traditions and differentiates from others, the other two monotheistic traditions being Christianity and Judaism, which were present during the Prophet's time in Medina. But later on, they would argue that the doctrine of supersession was probably extended to the idea of superiority of Muslims, particularly as a community, over others. This was probably assisted in part by the existence in Islam of concepts such as jizya, which is a form of tax, and zimma, which is a contract of protection for non-Muslims in a Muslim state. These concepts emphasized the political dominance of Muslims over others in Muslim states and the superiority of Muslims over others in terms of citizenship rights, for example. Of course, it is possible to interpret the development of this idea of supersession differently. What I have just presented here is an interpretation that appears to be popular among today's theological inclusivists. On the issue of Islam versus Islam, often the starting point is that when the Quran uses the term Islam, for example, in the verse that says, "Whoever seeks a religion other than Islam will not be accepted." Theological inclusivists argue that in such verses, Islam is referring to self surrender or submission to God. For them, Islam in these verses does not refer to a specific formal religion, such as the religion that was taught by Prophet Muhammad. For example, Imtiaz Yusuf and Mahmoud Ayub, two contemporary theological inclusivists, reject the theological exclusivist interpretation of Islam in these verses. Imtiaz Yusuf, for example, argues that the term Islam in such verses refers broadly to the act of self-surrender. This means that it encompasses all of those who have surrendered to God since the dawn of human history. Mahmoud Ayub takes this argument even further and suggests that Islam in these verses was not the name of a formal religion. It was a term used in the Quran to refer to the attitude of the entire creation before God. So, for Ayub, everything that God made or created submits to him. This is the first meaning of the word Islam for him. The term Muslim comes from this meaning of Islam. A Muslim therefore refers to any human being who submits to God. So, if a person expresses faith in God, in the one God, and tries to obey the one God in everything they do, they are submitting to God and should be considered followers of Islam according to this view. This is the case regardless of whether the person actually follows Prophet Muhammad or not. We will now look at some other contemporary theological inclusivists with a focus on the ideas that we have been exploring in this lecture. Here we will be looking at a couple of examples. Asma Afsaruddin is an Islamic scholar and contemporary thinker or theological inclusivist who argues that the Quran has an inclusive approach towards other religions. Her approach highlights several Quranic verses that describe Jews and Christians as members of a larger pious community. For instance, she refers to Quran chapter 2 verse 62 and chapter 3 verse 113, which you can follow up if you like. These verses for Afsaruddin clearly suggest that as long as people believe in the one God and act righteously, they are assured of salvation in the afterlife. So it is this ethical and righteous conduct that the Quran wants to see in addition to belief in one God, according to her. This is then much more important than the particular religious tradition that an individual follows. Saruddin argues that it is the sharing of common standards of ethical and righteous conduct that brings Muslims and people of other religions together. She notes the phrase used in the Quran, ummatan wasatan, which means a moderate nation or community. In chapter 2, verse 143, the Quran uses this phrase to refer to the Muslim community. But in chapter 5, verse 66, the phrase ummah, which also means a moderate community, is used to describe righteous Jews and Christians. In other words, Jews and Christians are described as a balanced or a moderate community, just as Muslims are or have been described in the Quran. Interestingly, Afsaruddin notes that this interpretation of the relevant verses has a long history. For example, she says, Muqatil ibn Sulaiman, an early commentator on the Quran of the 8th century of the Common Era, used the term Ummah Muqtasida to describe all people of the book. This means Christians, Jews, and Muslims. Ummah Muqtasida means moderate community. Ibn Kathir, another commentator on the Quran of the 14th century of the Common Era, also emphasizes the Quran's use of the term Ummah Muqtasida. For Ibn Kathir, moderation or being moderate is perhaps one of the most important ethical norms that God insists on, not just for Muslims, but for all people of the book. While each tradition may have developed or may have different religious practices, they all share this underlying ethic. Again, this approach recognizes difference but also emphasizes a degree of commonality, particularly with reference to this ethical norm. So Afsaruddin's work is important not only because it is a contemporary example of theological inclusivism, but because it highlights some of the earlier attempts to recognize and acknowledge other religious communities. Let us now look at Abdulaziz Sachedina. Abdulaziz Sachedina is an important figure in the area of theological inclusivist thought today, or what some refer to as religious pluralism. Himself refers to this as religious pluralism, but we'll use the term theological inclusivism. Sachedina argues there is only one real answer to halting religious conflict in the world today. He argues that believers need to adopt an inclusive attitude towards people of other faiths and, of course, other religions and faiths. And this inclusivism needs to be able to accommodate the beliefs of others instead of being competitive about what is true. For Sachedina, this is really important for religiously diverse societies. To achieve this, Sachedina argues that it is important to distinguish between private faith and public practice of this faith. This is a distinction, he says, that the Quran itself makes. So for him, it is not a new idea as such. Sachedina argues that in the private sphere, an individual's personal beliefs are very important. They are based on a person's private conviction. They are sacred, and no human authority can limit or influence them or say that they were wrong. In fact, recognition of freedom of conscience in matters of faith is the cornerstone of the Quran's position on religious pluralism, he argues. The point is that what happens in one's head or in one's mind or in one's conscience is completely free, and no one has the authority at all to control that. This is part of freedom of conscience, and as a right, it is considered an absolute right. So one implication of this is that in one's private sphere, one can hold on to theological exclusivist positions with regard to other religions or people of other religions. Here, one has a lot of freedom to believe whatever one wants to believe. However, Sachedina says that it is not the case when it comes to the public expression of an individual's beliefs. Public expression is not an absolute right, which means how a person's beliefs are manifested in public can be regulated or be subject to intervention or various restrictions. He goes on to say that personal faith is a private matter and hence inaccessible to public scrutiny. By contrast, the performance of duties, especially in congregation, makes one's private religious commitment objectively accessible in the community. This is a quote. Public expression of a person's beliefs, Sachedina argues, must be guided by the principle of coexistence. This means that religious communities must make an effort to live together in society, while also enjoying freedom to manage their own internal affairs. What this means is that whatever beliefs one may have in one's head or as part of one's freedom of conscience, whether they are exclusivist or not, when one interacts with people of other faiths, one should demonstrate respect for the other people and try not to hurt the feelings of other people, and be courteous and gentle and polite when one is dealing with people of other religious traditions. This way, whatever beliefs one may have, whether they are theologically exclusivist or not, those beliefs are in the private domain or in the private sphere. When one interacts with people of other faiths, that is in the public sphere, those private beliefs should remain private and should be expressed in a way that respects the principle of coexistence and respect for the other. Sachedina also argues that it is important that religious communities see one another as spiritual equals and recognize that each religious tradition is entitled to define its own distinctive path of salvation, even if one does not agree with them. One key verse that Sachedina draws on is chapter 2, verse 213, which says, "The people were one community, or ummah. Then God sent forth the prophets," to the end of the verse. For Sachedina, this verse reveals three truths. First, that humankind is one community created by God. Second, that differences in religious traditions came about because God sent different prophets at different times to different places. And finally, the third, that each religion was given its own book of revelation to help resolve religious differences. These truths, or these three truths, together seem to encompass the Quran's view of theological inclusivism or religious pluralism in Sachedina's view. This inclusivism does not deny religious difference, but it understands that differences are real and at times might cause problems. However, it emphasizes that human beings are all part of a universal community, despite differences in their beliefs. In terms of methodology, Sachedina is a scholar who reads the Quran contextually. Unlike some other methods of Quranic interpretation, a contextual approach takes the historical and cultural context into account when trying to understand what the Quran says on a particular issue. So instead of rejecting Quranic verses that seem difficult to understand or appears to be contradictory to other verses, contextual interpreters try to understand how these verses may have been understood in their original contexts. then they use this understanding to determine how they should be understood now. Sajdina's contextual approach to the Quran emphasizes that the Quran is a divine text, yet revelation was also historically influenced. This means that the Quran speaks to a specific time and place, as well as having a universal and timeless message. Sajdina critiques the doctrines of supersession and abrogation and argues that they were used to deny the true message of the Quran. So, what is for Sajdina the true message of the Quran? Well, most simply, it is a message that accepts and even encourages religious pluralism, or in other words, theological inclusivism. Just as the Quran is a revelation from God, Sajdina insists that the scriptures of the Jews and Christians are also revelations from God. That is, they all share the same underlying message, but just communicate the message differently. This shared message is that people need to submit to the absolute oneness of God and do what is right in His view. This message is important for theological inclusivists because it allows recognition of the other by acknowledging a basic common denominator in the faith. At the same time, it still stresses that faith has different manifestations. Sajdina argues that the Quran does not situate Islam as taught by Prophet Muhammad as the primary religion above all others. Instead, the Quran insists on submission or surrender to God, that is, Islam with a lowercase I in his view. It is what is referred to in the Quran, chapter 3, verse 85, which says, "Whoever desires another deen or religion other than Islam, it shall not be accepted of him, and in the next world he shall be among the losers." The word deen in the verse means creed or religion. So for Sajdina, this Quranic verse clearly insists on submission to God. It does not refer to Islam as taught by Prophet Muhammad. To further his argument, Sajdina quotes chapter 109, verses 1 to 5, which ends with the statement, "To you your religion, and to me my religion." It is this kind of acceptance that Sajdina argues for. His theological inclusivism project is not about promoting mere tolerance of the religious other. He wants to celebrate difference and emphasize that there are different paths towards God or salvation. Sajdina is a theological inclusivist. Some of his ideas that I have outlined here would not be acceptable from a mainstream Sunni or Shia theological point of view. For theological inclusivists, mainstream Muslim theology should move away from theological exclusivist positions as much as possible and accommodate at least the monotheistic religious traditions such as Judaism and Christianity. But the key ideas theological inclusivists are putting forward seem to be going against the entire Islamic theological tradition and the theological positions, by and large, most Muslim scholars today appear to adopt. So, where do the views of theological inclusivists such as Sajdina stand? Do Muslims really need to completely move away from the key theological positions that they have developed and continued to follow for many centuries in order to be inclusive as far as people of other faiths are concerned? This is an important question that we will be looking at closely in a later lecture. So, in summary, in this lecture, I have tried to look at a number of important theologically exclusivist views about other religions, validity of other religions, salvation, and the like. I have also looked at how some contemporary theological inclusivists have tried to put forward some ideas that they consider to be important for today's religiously plural societies, at least from a Muslim point of view. As I mentioned, the theological inclusivists' arguments remain still those of a very small minority, and the vast majority of Muslims, both historically and today, have remained very much as followers of the theologically exclusivist positions.